So let's bow in. Welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening Foundation course. We are working our way through the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma. It's the name of the 3-volume set by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. We're on volume 1. And tonight we are going to be looking at the chapter 62, Pratyekabuddhayana, the yana of individual salvation. Philip is going to be speaking, so Philip, take it away.
Welcome, everyone. So, chapter 62, the Pratyekabuddhayana. Judy Leaf makes the point in her introduction that these two yanas, the Sravaka-yana and the Pratyekabuddhayana, do not refer to sequential stages in the overall Buddhist path, but refer instead to practitioners' different styles of practicing and relating to the Dharma, as well as their different limitations and accomplishments. In contrast, the 5 paths that we've just studied a couple of weeks ago are a progression, beginning with accumulating merit and wisdom with the path of accumulation, and progressing toward the Mahayana with the path of unification. And we'll study those 2 paths in detail in the next 4 chapters. So you can think of the way these are related this way. These 2 yanas, the Sravaka-yana and the Pratyeka-yana, sort of run in parallel, and they start from ignorance from the very beginning, and they'll get you up to the level of individual liberation, the beginning of the Hinayana. It's not as if you have to do one in order to do the other. The paths you could think of as running this way, and there are 3 levels of the first path, the path of accumulation, and they build up, they're sort of collecting everything. And in the path of unification, you sort of put it all together, and they get you to the same place, the end of the Hinayana, individual liberation, and the entrance to the Mahayana. And then the paths continue. The next path you might remember is the path of seeing, where you have that first glimpse, that first direct glimpse of emptiness, an amazing time. That's the 3rd path, the path of seeing. And that's where the bhumis start. That bhumi is called the joyful bhumi. Then there are 9 more with the 4th path, the path of meditation. And finally, the 5th path, the path of no more learning. That's a level of enlightenment. But we're down here in the Hinayana, and we're going to focus tonight on this yana, the Pratyekabuddhayana, which parallels the Sravaka-yana. You'll see a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. It's worth mentioning this because people have a tendency to think they are sequential, because in the Sravaka-yana, remember, we're talking about one-fold egolessness. That's what they realize. And in this yana, they realize more than that. They realize what's called 1.5-fold egolessness. And when we get to the Mahayana, that's where we're realizing 2-fold egolessness. But it's not as if one leads to the other and then to the next. It's better to think of them as parallel paths, different, separate parallel paths, getting you to the same place. So let's start with characteristics of the Pratyekabuddhas. In the beginning of this chapter, Chogyam Trungpa distinguishes the Sravakas from the Pratyekabuddhas, basically on the basis of personality types. The idea of the Pratyekabuddhayana is that the awakened state of mind could be achieved by oneself alone. Pratyeka means solitary, so it's solitary Buddha. So the awakened state of mind could be achieved by oneself alone, without working with anybody else, without working with an instructor or teacher. Rinpoche describes the Pratyekabuddhas as antisocial and arrogant, in that they prefer not to seek a personal teacher or an individual guide. They have very little desire. They are highly intelligent and intellectual, and are able to accomplish a degree of liberation. They are very self-reliant and knowledgeable. They're very individualistic. They do not want to relate with any hierarchy, organization, or institutional setup. It is a self-made person approach. He says, quite possibly such people would appreciate nature and poetry as well as hardship and industrious work. He says they do not like any kind of religion, preferring to search in their own way, by their own means. They have less tendency for neurosis, except for the neurosis of their own arrogance. They have little need for entertainment and little confusion. They don't want to submit to anyone who is seemingly more highly developed or deepened in the spiritual journey. There is a rejection of the notion of lineage. So two things stand out here in sharp contrast to everything that we've learned so far and that you'll learn moving forward. The first is the relationship to the teacher. In Buddhism, that's a critically important thing, and it starts here in the Hinayana with a teacher who introduces you to the teachings. And moving forward, both the student and the teacher evolve, and the teacher is seen as a spiritual friend who carries you through the next levels. And in the highest levels, it's thought that you can't proceed without a guru. That is the meeting of the mind of the student and the teacher on that level that make enlightenment possible. That's one thing. The second is related to that very much, and that's this rejection of the notion of lineage. One of the things that makes Buddhism a living thing, and it's been living for 2,600 years, is the fact that these philosophies, these thoughts, these teachings, I avoid using the word religion, but it's sort of in that neighborhood. They've come down over 2,600 years, person to person to person in an oral transmission. That's what the lineage is. As you get into it further and further and further, you'll realize and begin to feel that each of you are part of that lineage that goes all the way back 2,600 years to Lopa. It's astounding. And every day we do the chants, Great Vajradhara, Tilo, Nara. That's Tilopa, and Naropa, his first student, his main student. At any rate, the Pratyekabuddhayanas, those folks don't really have the same appreciation of teachers or lineages, and they are unique in that way in Buddhism. Chogyam Trungpa says the Pratyekabuddhas have very little compassion. They do not want to bother with or relate to anyone else. They do not want to help anyone or teach anyone. They would simply like to be left alone. One of their best virtues is quite certainly and definitely that they are not nuisances to society, but they do not contribute anything to society either. They do not take part in anything. So in a bit, I'll come back to two of these ideas, the one about compassion and the one about not participating. But let's move on to the view of the Pratyekabuddhayana. Pratyekabuddhists believe in the Four Noble Truths and the message that possibly one has to give up one's existence. Pratyekabuddhists relate to reality with relative reference points. They believe everything is completely interrelated and everything is independent. Pratyekabuddhists believe things are defined by their relationship to other things. Black is black because there is a white. If this happens, then that happens. So two things there. The bit about believing that things are completely interrelated and everything being interdependent. Remember, John has said over and over again, there are three main characteristics of the misunderstanding of reality, and that is that we have a tendency to think things are permanent, and that they're unitary, and that they're independent. And one of the discoveries of the Pratyekabuddhas is that they are not independent. In fact, they're just the opposite. They're entirely interrelated. They're interdependent. And that brings us to this next part, that things are defined by their relationship to other things. This is another huge realization of theirs, because this is the reference point of simple causality. This is the Nidana principle, which is, you'll remember, the wheel of life. Incidental situations are meaningful. And this is a profoundly true view. This wisdom goes all the way to the Vajrayana. Pratyekabuddhists believe nirvana and samsara are related reference points, which is ultimately true. Black wouldn't exist without white. Nirvana wouldn't exist without samsara. Everything is profoundly interrelated. Pratyekabuddhists define salvation as the non-existence of ignorance. And that's what we've been learning the whole time. That's what the Four Noble Truths are about. That all of the suffering is due to ignorance, the ignorance of misperceiving reality, the ignorance of not understanding the concept of emptiness. By salvation here, they're talking about liberation. For them, it's individual liberation. It's not enlightenment. But still, that's what they're talking about. And they're defining it as the non-existence of ignorance. The wheel of life, the nidanas, that starts with ignorance. That's the first thing. And then it goes through those 12 steps, one thing leading to another, leading to another, leading to another. So they figured all of that out. The ignorance related to not understanding emptiness, egolessness, the same thing. It is the root cause of suffering. This ignorance is the first nidana on the outer ring of the wheel of life. It is what starts the cycle of samsara. So all of this is considered a true view. And then he talks about the discipline of the Pratyekabuddhayana. The discipline is the same as the Pratyekabuddhayana discipline. There is an emphasis on monasticism and monastic discipline. They base their discipline on the understanding of cause and effect, what we were just talking about. Cause and effect is based on the continuity between two separate events. If you plant a seed, it will grow into a plant. Because of separation, there is continuity. That is precisely the idea of the 12 nidanas. Events being separate, events having continuity. You have to breathe in order to breathe out. And then he talks a bit about the practice of the Pratyekabuddhayana. The focus of the practice is study. Traditionally, a student would wander around the charnel grounds, contemplating death, and eventually come to an understanding of the 12 nidanas, the wheel of life, the chain reaction of karmic cause and effect from ignorance to death. In their practice of shamatha vipassana meditation, Pratyeka Buddhists are caught up in their own formal sitting practice rather than working with post-meditation. And this is problematic, Chogyam Trungpa says. And I think that's related to compassion too, and this sort of antisocial non-participation. But I'll come back to those in a bit. The Pratyeka Buddha style of teaching is to attain arhatship. That's individual liberation. That's the end stage of the Hinayana. And then manifest various miracles. This approach differs from the previous yana. Sravaka people proclaim and propagate, but in the Pratyekabuddhayana, there is no talking. One simply manifests one's state of existence. And then Rinpoche moves into this section, the achievement of the Pratyekabuddhayana. This section gets a little hard to follow. Pratyeka Buddhists have achieved 1.5-fold egolessness. They have achieved the egolessness of self by working back through the 12 nidanas to ignorance. They have begun to develop the egolessness of other, the egolessness of dharmas, but they haven't totally embraced that. Pratyekabuddhas understand the non-existence of substantiality, the tangent. So when we talk about defining emptiness, those three things, permanence, independence, and the unitariness of things, this is the unitariness of things, the non-existence of substantiality. Unlike the Shravakas, Pratyekabuddhas don't believe in partless particles. Remember from our last class that Shravakas really wanted to get to the root of reality. And they really thought if they just worked hard enough and dug deep enough, they would come down finally to these little tiny particles that you couldn't divide any further. You couldn't divide them into any smaller parts, the so-called partless particles, the atoms, which related to tangible stuff, and the instants, which related to intangible stuff. The Pratyekabuddhas have moved beyond that to a large degree. So they don't believe in partless particles. At least they don't believe that atoms are ultimately real. They don't believe that matter is permanent, unitary, and independent. Matter is the operative word there. So some commentators maintain that the Pratyekabuddhas do still believe in the ultimate reality of the instants. And those are the partless particles related to time and non-matter phenomena, right? Stuff that it's really hard to, the intangible stuff like gravity and time and consciousness. So they hadn't gotten to the point of understanding the emptiness of those things. And those commentators feel that that explains why their understanding, the Pratyekabuddha's understanding of the emptiness of dharmas is incomplete. Because they've understood the emptiness of the atoms, but not the emptiness of the instants. So that's the 1.5-fold emptiness. Chogyam Trungpa approaches this same thing from a different aspect, and he argues it this way. He says that the Pratyekabuddha's understanding is incomplete because they try to hang on to the egolessness of dharmas as a solid thing, the idea of egolessness itself. And that this then rebounds and compromises their understanding of the egolessness of self as well. It sort of undermines everything. Chogyam Trungpa teaches that the ego of dharmas has two aspects, grasping and fixation. Grasping is the grosser level of the ego of dharmas, and fixation is the more subtle. With grasping, when you perceive the phenomenal world, you first latch on to something and possess it. With fixation, the whole thing begins to sort of soak into your existence. By overcoming grasping but not fixation, the Pratyekabuddha has achieved a 1.5-fold realization of egolessness. So of all of the Dharma that's out there, you might consider that it's easier to think about trees and mountains and the emptiness of those things than it is to think about time and gravity and consciousness and the emptiness of those things. And the Pratyekabuddhas have understood the emptiness of the first things, but not the second. And in the second is the concept of emptiness, right? Which sort of comes back and undermines everything for them. It even comes all the way back to their understanding of the emptiness of self and undermines that to some degree. So there's a woman named Elizabeth Callahan who's referred to in a footnote in our text. She's a Kaigyu scholar and a preeminent translator. And she explains this concept this way. She says, Pratyekabuddhas realize the absence of the absence of self-entity of the perceived object. So they realize the emptiness of the perceived object, grasping, but not the absence of self-entity of the perceiver, fixation. So this is another way of saying that the Pratyekabuddhas have realized the emptiness of the atoms, but not of the instants. So they experience this thing and they understand the emptiness of it, but they're still caught up and believing in that understanding of the emptiness. And this is how the understanding of the egolessness of self is ultimately compromised. So, in the middle of page 484, Chogyam Trungpa says, so the Pratyeka Buddha does not actually experience the egolessness of self in the fullest sense. He goes on to explain, at this point, the understanding of the egolessness of self is on a somewhat intellectual, experiential level. You have not quite fully felt it. If you had complete freedom from the egolessness of self, then how could the product of that ego still be operating? And the fixation, the second portion of the egolessness of dharmas, has not been tapped at all, which is why that kind of problem exists. That's the part about coming back. This is what is meant by 1.5-fold egolessness. So the whole idea of egolessness has to become much more mature. Okay, so far? Are you still with me? Understanding egolessness will lead to the cessation of suffering. That's why we're spending so much time on this. Chogyam Trungpa finishes this section by once more pointing out the absence of compassion in the Pratyekabuddhayana. Generally in Buddhism, compassion is said to arise spontaneously as the ego is diminished. And this makes sense intuitively, right? As your concern with yourself becomes less, you create the space to be able to be concerned with others. Compassion and the wisdom of emptiness are called the two wings of the bird in Buddhism, and they're usually in balance. But here, in the Pratyekabuddhayana, there seems to be a lot more emphasis on emptiness than there is on compassion. Let me hit on this in another way. His Holiness the Dalai Lama once said in a teaching I heard that emptiness without compassion is absolutely worthless. It's worse than useless. So in Buddhism, the two things are always joined together, emptiness and compassion. So these two great bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri, they're joined together. When the Buddha taught the Heart Sutra, which is about emptiness, who did he pick to teach it? He picked Avalokiteshvara, who is the bodhisattva of compassion. He didn't pick Manjushri. So the two things are welded together on every level, from the very beginning to the very end. You get to the highest levels of teaching and you look at reality, and reality is said to be space and emptiness. At that point, emptiness is wisdom. Space is awareness. Awareness is compassion. It just, the ego is totally gone and compassion has replaced it almost automatically. But here the Pratyeka Buddhas seem to be really lacking in that. Okay, and then Chogyam Trungpa goes on to talk about Pratyeka Buddha mentality. And this is a short section where he talks about the process of the Pratyeka Buddha practice as being one of recycling, refiltering, and purification. And up until this point, I was thinking of the Pratyeka Buddhas as being sort of a historical group of people. But Chogyam Trungpa then goes on to talk about, or at least a bit, to talk about the difficulty or impossibility of teaching people who essentially don't want to work with a teacher. And clearly he is seeing Pratyekabuddhas come to him for interviews, one-on-one, one-on-one interviews in real time. Then he goes on to talk about the Sravakas and the Pratyekabuddhas in general. And this, we're getting toward the end of the chapter here. This section is a summary of the similarities and differences of these two yanas. In the Sravakayana, Rinpoche talks about the Four Noble Truths and the technique of shamatha. He talks about discipline and then awareness on top of mindfulness and the development of vipassana and then prajna. He talks about understanding the 12 Nidana chain reaction of karmic cause and effect from ignorance to death. He talks about awareness permeating all of our daily habits and the development of appreciation. Then he shifts to the Pratyekabuddhayana when talking about developing Hinayana discipline. In the Sravakayana, we realize that everything is suffering. In the Pratyekabuddhayana, we realize that everything is discipline. Together, everything becomes workable. The appreciation of, here he's back to talking about the Hinayana in general. He says, the appreciation of suffering tempers arrogance with compassion and humbleness. We begin to emulate and appreciate our teacher. Gratitude develops. We begin to attain individual salvation. Chogyam Trungpa says, that's the Hinayana path in a nutshell. With individual liberation, you've learned to develop maitri, loving kindness, toward yourself, which is where compassion begins. At the Sravakayana level, you're entering into the Four Noble Truths. On the Pratyekabuddhayana level, you are actually doing it. You practice Buddhism in yourself, by yourself, and for yourself. You become a Pratyekabuddha, a self-made person. He says that's not so bad. To begin with, you have to learn how to be tender and kind to yourself. This is the seed of your ability to expand tenderness and kindness to others. So this section in particular could make it sound as if these two yanas were sequential. Remember, Rinpoche is teaching that they're not. It's more like they're parallel. The sequence of the path in the Hinayana is the three paths of accumulation, then the path of unification, then moving into the Mahayana, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and finally the path of no more learning. He finishes with this section called Wakefulness and Openness. Chogyam Trungpa concludes with these comments related to the Hinayana in general. He says, because of Vipassana, you do not get stuck at the level of individual salvation. Vipassana is a source of prajna, or discriminating awareness wisdom. Mindfulness awareness grows. Your vision expands. Your world expands. Your intelligence is sharpened and your awareness is bursting with energy. Your post-meditation practice is even more important than sitting meditation at this point. A general sense of wakefulness and openness is taking place always. As Buddhists, you should always be open and awake in whatever you do. You are on your way to full awakening. And then I wanted to come back at the end in the interest of fairness and clear seeing and say a little bit more about the Pratyekabuddhas from the point of view of another commentator. And he was talking about the history of the Indian subcontinent and what it must have been like to live on those plains for those 2,000 years. Because those plains are overrun by barbarian hordes over and over and over again. Mongols and Muslims. And it was all looting and fire and rape and murder. And so this commentator was saying that perhaps the reason the Pratyekabuddhas didn't relate to teachers was because they lived in a dark age, because there were no teachers. And perhaps the reason they didn't teach many students was because there weren't many students. And perhaps the reason they were solitary was because every time they got together in a group, they were wiped out. So John could talk about that history a bit. I'm basically done. But the largest university in the ancient world, Nalanda, was reduced to ruin. Its libraries burned during these times. And Buddhism was wiped out on the Indian subcontinent. Anyhow, thank you for your attention and for your practice.
So we could have questions, discussion. Anybody know any Pratyeka Buddhas? Self-contained people. I guess they're not very social.
They almost sound like, in some ways, it reminds me of almost like a personality typology or something, you know.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, a very self-contained loner.
Like introverts compared to extroverts.
Like what?
Like these two groups, introverts compared to extroverts.
Right. Well, you know, of the two types, the rhinoceros and the parrot, the rhinoceros type is much more prevalent. The rhinoceros Pratyeka Buddha. They're just, you know, very lonely, alone, solitary. Fred, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I found this initially, it was very irritating.
One day.
You know, I found myself getting triggered. I'm like, huh. It was hitting very close to home. And I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, just the lonerness, the unwilling to open, you know, pretending, you know, things might all be together. And then, you know, I'm like, all right, let me just sit with this irritation. And I'm like, what's he trying to do here? You know, Chogyam Trungpa. And I'm like, he's trying to wake me up. You know, much like the sun with a seed. He's like, get out there. And you know, like,
You think you have Pratyeka Buddha in you?
oh yeah, more so in the past. You know, I think it was more of just a you know, residue from the past, especially about the 12 Nidana thing. It's like you understand the 12 Nidanas. Like before I started studying and practicing Buddhism, like I got very proficient at astrology too. It was almost like it was an assault on remnants of my ego to a degree. And then I remember the story of when Pema Chodron first had her interview with Chogyam Trungpa. Her whole life was falling apart, and she was just talking about formalities, the weather, and then he got up to walk away suddenly, and then she said something like, "I'm getting divorced. My whole life is falling apart," and she opened up to him, and then I think he responded something to the effect of, you know, when you get hit in the ocean, when you get hit by a wave and you're on the ocean floor, you just got to get up.
Tanya. Tanya, you're muted.
I would like to say that I also agree with Frederick. I found this information a little bit kind of disturbing because I also consider myself extremely quiet, highly introverted. But I do know
What?
that I consider myself highly introverted and extremely quiet my whole entire life. But one of the things as an adult, I've always challenged myself, like taking a teaching career. And every day I have to be challenged in the area of helping others, coming out of my shell, facing the world, even though I know that I would very much prefer to stay at home and just read and make art all the time. I definitely push myself out there to grow because I really appreciate the idea of just learning about life, even though it's not easy. So.
No.
Tanya, to you and to Frederick as well, I would say I'm also an introvert, but I would point out to you and Frederick that Pratyeka Buddhists would not join a Sangha. And yet here you are.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think the first time I spoke to John, Bernie referred me. He's like, go learn some no nonsense meditation. And I asked him, I'm like, I think I understand the Buddha, the Dharma. I'm like, is this the Sangha? He's like, yeah. I'm like, oh, okay. And I just did it.
Yeah, and I would agree with Frederick too. I did the same thing. I felt as if I needed to do that part in order to grow. So I joined the Sangha to grow in that way with people.
It really is amazing. Lotro said something at the close of our meeting last night when we were saying goodbye and thank you. And he said, I'm thankful for the magic of the Sangha. And that was such a perfect word. We were talking about emptiness, which often gives me a headache because I have trouble understanding it. But yeah, it was just magical.
Yeah, I like the part where you talked about how what the Pratyeka Buddha does is appreciates his or her own achievement. And this becomes, they might be understanding egolessness, and then they say, I'm understanding egolessness. So ego's right back there again.
Yeah, and the suggestion is that problem even goes behind them, so to speak, and undermines their understanding of the egolessness of self. It's not just that it undermines their understanding of the egolessness of the atoms and that half of the egolessness of phenomena. It goes all the way back to the beginning and it undermines everything.
Yeah, that's where I found cutting through spiritual materialism so profound.
How so?
Because exactly to Philip's point right there, before joining, the Sangha and practicing meditation, I thought I understood something. And I looked at that, as an achievement, as something concrete. And I'm like, oh no, that's a deception. And you need the Sangha, the teacher, the spiritual friend to help point out that deception because you're not going to see it yourself. Like the story of a Sangha, right? He's probably being a Pratyekabuddha. He's meditating in the cave first 9 years, right? And then he gets somebody's trying to water down a rock with water on the rock, right? And he goes back, and then another 12 years with the iron with the feather. And then finally, when he gets the vision of Maitreya, he tries to help another being.
I remember Trungpa Rinpoche had a student that he expelled from the Sangha, which we all were rather shocked by. He actually told this fellow to get out. And when we asked him why he did that, he said that this person was so embedded in his own sense of self, that rejection like this was the only message he could hear. And the fellow came back and became a member of the Sangha again eventually. I mean, do we really know these? How many people know a Pratyekabuddha, a rhinoceros, a person who's really so self-contained?
I think I've come across people like that. Um, Not that they're Buddhist, but just in general, like as a personality typology. And, and there's a stereotype, like people that are survivalists, like they have great skills, like they could live out in the woods with hardly anything for a long, long time. And it's amazing, or someone that's great with their hands and putting things together or in their workshop or whatever. But yet there's this isolation. It's like that's sort of like their Achilles or their clay feet, like there's some lines of development that are immature or not even are cut off. And to me, this kind of speaks to, like you talked about not being compassionate. This speaks to the idea that, like Philip mentioned, there's these two wings. Um, you've got to take it. You've got to take it to the world. You've got to take it to the streets. That's why I think it's pretty amazing, like Tanya shared, like, she's a teacher. She's like having to put herself in front of people like many hours a day. That's like amazing. Like that's really challenging that tendency, which I think is awesome. But I, I think, anyway, to answer your question, I think I've seen people that they may not be Buddhist, but they have that personality typology.
Maria has her hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Um, as also as an introverted uh, personality, if you will, I was just thinking about the importance of making connections with a Sangha, because I think that many of us introverted people are very in tune with what's not good for us and what's not nourishing. And being in touch with spiritual friends provides a kind of nourishment and strength that enables us to go out and make contact with the wider world, with just being able to do it in a way that is very difficult without the support of spiritual friends. So I'll just add that.
Thank you. By the way, Miriam, you can see her box there. She's from Toronto.
Ah. Hi, Miriam. Thank you.
Yeah. Sarah.
Before I found this Sangha, I was studying the profound treasury of Ocean of Dharma on my own. And at one point, I read the book A Stranger in the Woods. And it was about a man who lived out in the woods by himself in Maine for 27 years.
Did
And I
what?
remember he lived in the forest by himself for 27 years. He was like a real forest hermit. I think he almost died. He almost froze to death. So he was like taking some food from people's houses. So they ended up arresting. They found him. They took him to jail. But I remember when I read that book, I was so drawn to that lifestyle. I just thought that sounded so like just something I really wanted to try to do myself. And then I got to the third book and I didn't understand it at all, of the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma, which led me to this group. And I'm so glad I did. So I don't know, maybe I was drawn to that kind of Pratyekabuddha or Pratyekayana path before, but now I'm really glad that I've given that up, and I would never move out to the woods and try to live alone for 27 years now. I don't think. But I was really drawn to that when I read that book.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Don got me thinking about this when he said something about like the self-sufficient person or the self-contained person, and then I think Sarah was hitting on this, but I think everyone who commented on Maria and Tanya and Fred started off. I think there's a and I think this is why it's irritating too, the feeling of irritation that Fred started out with. I think there's I think there's a big difference between a self-sufficient person and an introvert. They're totally different things. And they might look like the same thing, but being an introvert isn't about feeling self-sufficient, complete. I don't need anybody to rely on. People don't need to rely on me, and I think that's more of the practical, whatever. I don't have the word in front of me. Um, and I think that it's interesting because I think that's what Sarah was talking about in terms of that book, and maybe her interest in the book. But what made me interested in the book is that it's about a self-sufficient person who doesn't need to rely out on people, on outside technology maybe, and is just making everything work without, just self-sufficient and and content and self-accepting and you know theoretically anyway, who knows what really goes on inside of people's heads, but the introvert, I don't think has anything to do with not wanting to rely on other people, being self-sufficient, feeling like you don't need other people to either help you navigate, survival, or to, rely on them in an emotional way or any kind of way. They're they're complete without the relationship. Introverts, I don't think introversion has anything to do with it. Introversion could be many, many things. And I think Maria was touching on this. Introversion is really someone who maybe does need to rely on other people or understands the interconnection and understands aspirationally how interdependent we all are, and but puts up the barriers to that because somehow something is wrong with that. They equate a healthy feeling of a need for connection and interdependence and understanding that and realizing interdependence, but they equate that with being needy, where also these inherent judgments we have of good and bad come in too, right? As opposed to seeing the realization of interdependentness and interconnection, you know, being needy as maybe as a step on the path towards that view, as opposed to being needy as something bad or wanting the connection with other people as something bad or weak or some such thing. Anyway, that's what I got.
Jen.
Hi. So, yeah, thanks for your comment on, and I was, yeah, as we're reading this chapter, it's, we have a whole bunch of introverts in this group, don't we? And I'm, in the first part of the reading, I didn't feel irritation. I feel utter and complete lack of comprehension. And that is likely because I am an extrovert. And I appreciate what Don said. My understanding of what an introvert is that they find being with people draining and they require alone time in order to recharge. And extroverts get their energy by being with other people. And that's, I mean, I used to identify as that the pandemic kind of turned me into an ambivert, it would seem. And I also have a lot of my own experience of the power of groups. And the way that really came clear to me was back in July when I connected with this morning meditation group, um, and it was my, first, my introduction to finding this group. But I've done meditation for years, and I've done meditation off and on with apps, like get out of bed in the morning, find the app and hit the meditation and drift in and out as I'm listening, of many kinds. But there's something about this group that meets on Zoom it isn't this group, by the way, but it's getting to, every single morning, 7:05 to 7:35 Pacific time. It's just there. For some reason, it was different than what I've done on my own. And the for some reason the difference is now that I'm sitting here in this chair now. And there's a good deal of what we're reading in general, not just this today, that's a little bit that is way above me. So I'm doing a lot of listening. But left to my own devices, I can get some really creative interpretations of things. And I feel like I need and want, some experts or people that have gone before me to enlighten me. So, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. So here we have this picture of Pratyeka Buddhas as being so completely absorbed in their own experience of meditation and the intellectual understanding that they develop, that they have no need of social contact or little need of it with other people, and they tend to be loners, Ranasarai. Interesting. Do you know people like this? Or maybe parrots, talking to themselves all the time. But the main thing is that both types, both the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha, have developed an understanding of egolessness that is genuine. That the ego, what we call an I, is just a concept, a mental creation, and doesn't have any true existence. The problem, then he says something interesting in here. He says that one of the problems is that while they understand egolessness, they know that they understand egolessness, which is another subtler kind of ego. I understand egolessness. And both the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha do this. So I think one lesson that I get out of this is that you've just got to keep putting one foot in front of the other, meditating, studying, and letting it happen. Because if you try to take control, as it were, and evaluate your own success, that just gets in the way. It becomes another kind of egotism. That's the way I hear it. I don't know if everyone else agrees or disagrees.
Well, I agree with that. If you think back to the 10 bhumis, it's like over and over and over again. You think you finally got it figured out. You're finally there, only to discover that no, somehow you've missed this part. And in a way, you're starting over again and getting to the next place. And it's described as taking 3 countless eons to make that journey. That's a long time.
Yeah, the question is where each one of us is in those countless eons. Some of us might be at the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end. And we don't know.
Yeah, as I, reflected on the irritation, I found it encouraging. And, like it was that, to make that leap. I think it's, where's this in Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation. They make the distinction between, lesser beings and then greater beings. And, the lesser beings being on the Hinayana path, and then the greater beings being on the Mahayana path to go out. And the Mahayana is you go big. And the Hinayana, keeping it in, trying to keep it cool, right? Is playing it small in this scheme. And that's what came up on the reflection of this.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I just find that if I keep doing it, I can feel the change almost in spite of myself.
Yeah, and Philip, I think, nailed my first experience of, actually doing the meditation. Like all this intense suffering hit and just tears. And I'm like, I thought I did this already, and then just relaxing into just that and letting it go. And then in spite of myself, it was just gone.
Yeah. I feel like it's a process that we submit to, put ourselves into, work with. Well, we could end early tonight. Anybody have anything more that they would like to say?
I like the way I guess Judith Leaf capped this chapter with the wakefulness and openness section. It just kind of provided a nice, to me, inspirational kind of guideline or path about just what we were talking about. Like you said, put one foot in front of the other. It may not feel great all the time, but over time, there's things open up. I like this sentence near the bottom of 487. The Prajna scans all over the world with your seeing, hearing, feeling, smiling, and tasting. And then it says, that is why doing your post-meditation practice is even more important than sitting meditation at this point. In post-meditation, you want to be on the dot all the time, each time. I don't know if I'm on the dot all the time, each time, but I think like what you just said, in spite of myself, it just happens sometimes. And I, I think it's a byproduct of participation, the studying and the sitting practice and the Sangha.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think it was yesterday, Val, you were asking, why am I still doing shamatha? And I think it was yesterday, Kwan was describing picking up a cup. And that's the answer, right? It's paying attention and appreciation. And the whole universe is in the feeling of the touch of the human flesh on that porcelain for that instant. The whole universe is there. But usually we never notice that. But we could notice that all the time.
Hey, sweetheart.
Yeah, he talks about the importance of post-meditation at this stage of the path. He says, Vipassana is the source of prajna, or discriminating awareness wisdom, which is extremely inquisitive and keeps looking further. And as you develop awareness, you develop further mindfulness too. With mindfulness awareness, everything is looked at, and everything is very much cared for. And we could live our lives that way, very much caring for everything. An expanded world, greater intelligence, awareness bursting with energy. Prajna scans all over the world with your seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, and tasting, so that your post-meditation practice, that means your meditation in daily life, is more important than sitting at this point. In post-meditation, you want to be on the dot always. This is a meditation, being aware in daily life. You want to be on the dot always. A general sense of wakefulness and openness is taking place always. Openness and inquisitiveness. And then he says, with awareness, this awareness in daily life, you do not get stuck, but you are on your way somewhere. You are on your way to full awakening. Maria.
Hi there. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. This is a bit non sequitur from what you were just expressing, but I just wanted to ask, as someone who I've just kind of plopped into the middle of what feels like a very long conversation, maybe over a 2,000-year conversation, where you're discussing, I believe, Mahayana versus Hinayana. Is that referring to Theravada when we're talking about the Hinayana? No, it's not.
What happened was that after the Buddha died,
Yeah,
the Sangha fractured.
yeah,
The period after his death, almost to the time of Christ, was called the period of the 18 schools.
yeah.
Who knows how many there really were, but because there was no written history much, and then people didn't write much in those days. It was all passed down orally mostly. But in any event, there were a lot of schools, and one of them in India was called the Sarvastivada school. No, excuse me, the Sthaviravada school. Sthavira means elder, and Vada means doctrine. So this was the doctrine of the elders. This particular school moved south, and at about somewhere around the 2nd century BC, it made its way to Ceylon, where Sthaviravada was translated into Ceylonese as Theravada. Sthavira, Thera, they mean the same thing, elder. So it's the doctrine of the elders. And from Ceylon, it spread across Southeast Asia. This doctrine, the Sthaviravada doctrine and the Theravada, was definitely Hinayana. Later, what happened in India, going all the way to the time when Buddhism was wiped off the face of India in about the 12th century, 11th century, Buddhism kept developing, and it was developed into this three-yana system, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. The Hinayana includes the Shravakayana and the Pratyekabuddhayana. The Mahayana is the vehicle of the Bodhisattvas, and then the Vajrayana is the most advanced yana. These teachings went from India to China, the Mahayana, and a little bit of the Vajrayana around the time of Christ. They went to Tibet in around the 7th century, but really didn't take root until the 8th century in Tibet. And by the time they did that, they came from India in this form, these three yanas, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, of which the Shravakayana and the Pratyekabuddhayana, that they're the twofold division of the Hinayana. So then what happened was that, Buddhism, the reason it was wiped off the face of India, Buddhism was a largely monastic phenomenon. Most Buddhists were either monks or nuns. And so they lived in monasteries, and especially they congregated in the great universities. There were 3 great universities, Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri. I mean, if you visit the site of Nalanda today, it goes all the way to the horizon. That just doesn't quit. You see, they've reconstructed some of the buildings, by putting in foundations where they excavated and found the remains. So Buddhism, being largely monastic and focused in these institutions, was an easy target. And when the Muslims invaded in the 11th century, invaded India, they couldn't wipe out Hinduism because Hinduism was in all the families. It was in the villages. It was a lay phenomenon. Everybody was a Hindu. They couldn't kill everybody. But the Buddhists were located in these institutions, these monasteries and universities, and they were easy target. All you had to do was wipe out that Nalanda and wipe out Odantapuri, and that's what the Muslims did. And basically they destroyed Buddhism in India. But by this time it had already gone, it went to China around the time of Christ. It went to Japan around the 7th century AD, about the same time it went to Tibet. It went to Korea around the 7th century, and it went to Mongolia in around the 11th century. And by the time the communists took over China, Buddhism was the most populous religion in the world. There were more Buddhists than there were adherents of any other religion. But a lot of those people were Chinese Buddhists, and when the communists suppressed Buddhism in China, they got rid of a lot of Buddhists temporarily. It's coming back now.
Thank you.
Our fellow student Xin Yi, her mother lives in China, and she's a Buddhist. And Xin Yi went back and visited her, and they went and visited Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and temples. So it's definitely coming back.
Thank you.
Well, these 2 prototypes, the Shravaka, the listener, the hearer, and then the Pratyekabuddha, who is a solitary person, a loner, meditates alone, studies alone. Anybody know any Pratyekabuddhas? We're a Sangha, so probably aren't you? There might be people who have that tendency here, but
Well, I'd say by definition, they're not here.
probably. Well,
And this is I'm understanding egolessness just because you have a glimpse of egolessness, you see a possibility, oh, if I have less ego, more things are possible. That's not the full dissolution of ego. There's more egolessness to come as we progress along these paths, which is quite exciting.
Indeed. When shunyata begins to happen, that's the non-existence of the external world, that it's just a constant arising and passing away. And what comes along with that in terms of the experience of the meditator is extreme vividness, the vividness of this world, because the concepts and the confusion that we have in our minds is stripped away. And so the practitioner begins to see this world much more vividly. It's kind of like, we've all experienced this. You're walking downstairs, maybe this is something from my memory, and light is coming through a window and it just hits you how beautiful and vivid and powerful that is. Or you're standing on the edge of a lake and suddenly the day is so gorgeous and it moves you, the color, the beauty of the sunlight, the intensity. That's comes with more and more with egolessness, with the discovery of shunyata, the emptiness of things not existing, but just being in a continual flux. And when we strip away all these notions of good and bad, better or worse, hope and fear, then the world begins to really emerge luminous. And so especially in the Vajrayana, they talk a lot about the union of luminosity and emptiness. We're moving into a very powerfully beautiful world, which all of us have experienced at least in glimpses, if not more.
Our words are so limited because what you're describing is, of course, not emptiness. I mean, it is, that's the word we use, but what you're describing is fullness, this almost unimaginable fullness.
Yeah, it is. The vividness of this world. Why don't we say the closing chants? Who's leading them? Don, you are, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll put them up on the screen. I'm going to mute all. So Don, unmute yourself.
We'll close by reciting a prayer for peace and with a dedication of merit generated by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Philip. Thank you, Philip and Don.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great class,
Welcome.
Philip. Thank you.
Please come back, Maria,
Oh, I will. I will. I look forward to it.
to meet you.
Thank you. You too.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.